Hello. Michael Joel Hall here. I wanted to talk to you about cognitive bias, its intersection with Ashtanga Yoga. When the Yoga Sutras talk about how we can eradicate our ignorance, it's by getting our jewel of perception as clear and unclouded as possible. And that means like fessing up to the fact that as humans, we experience all kinds of different bias and we can do something about the cognitive ones or the things that are called cognitive bias. And so in doing so, it's a great way to help eradicate some of the obstacles to yoga. Let's get into it. Okay. So first and foremost, let's talk about what cognitive bias is. It's the systematic pattern of deviation from the norm. So this means that we can find that sometimes the actions that we make aren't in alignment with the realities of the data. And we find that we do these kinds of things over and over again simply because, it's the mental model that we're working with. And mental models aren't a bad thing. They're oftentimes really necessary for us to make quick and intelligent decisions. But one of the things that happens when we don't remember to check our biases is that we end up with these judgment errors. And these judgment errors are inaccurate conclusions or basically drawing the wrong straw through your mental process and making decisions that maybe aren't in your best interest. And it becomes really interesting when we start making decisions that aren't in our own best interest, even when the data is right in front of us. It's not because we're stupid. It's because something's going on. And these are the judgment errors that cognitive bias create. You also can see it oftentimes in groupthink, meaning that we find that there are these moments where the rallying cry of everyone is again in the opposite direction of the things that would be most beneficial. And that if we were to take a step back and really assess the data to look at it, we would see quite clearly that other decisions should be made. And yet we sometimes don't make them. Why? Well, because other people are saying something's a great idea and we fall victim to peer pressure and that becomes groupthink. Groupthink is really dangerous, because it means that we stop being creative. But cognitive bias, like I said, it comes through a variety of different means. And it is necessary because we have to develop mental shortcuts to create these models that allow us to think quickly and on our feet when we need to. We have to be strategic oftentimes when we're within a time domain or a boundary. And so we're acting fast. And when we're pulling from our tacit or experienced learnings, we often try to be strategic in minimizing the time taken. And mental shortcuts can be really, really helpful for that. So it's not like they're all bad necessarily. It's when we don't check them that it's a problem. We can see the same thing when we're talking about our social influences. Oftentimes groupthink is thought of inside of poorly run businesses and mobs. But the reality is it's just peer pressure. And oftentimes peer pressure is sewn deeply into society that so much of the hypervigilance, so much of the consumeristic nature of the world around us is designed specifically to keep commerce running. But, maybe it's not always a great idea, but since everyone does it, we do it. And it's so weird because we know better. But it can be really helpful to understand that there are a few different types of cognitive bias. In fact, there are a ton of them, but I want to go over a few that we commonly see. The first is the availability heuristic, meaning we estimate the frequency of how often something is going to come up because of how often we're thinking about it. This creates all kinds of different biases, like recency bias, meaning thought of something recently, It's going to be on the forefront of our mind, as an example. And so these availabilities, our ability to think of something, it doesn't mean that it's the most likely. It's just the one that we can come up with the fastest. Um, Another great one that we see is the idea of an anchoring bias. This is when we rely too heavily on the first piece of information that we encounter. So I talked about having a recency bias, meaning that the most recent thing that we thought of is the thing that's most on our mind. Here, if you go to buy a car and the first car that you're shown is $50,000, and then you see a car and it's like not that much worse, it's like 5,000. You might think that that $25,000 car is a steal. But the truth of the matter is, it's still a $5,000 car, which is not a great deal. But because we saw it referenced to a really expensive car, which also wasn't much better, it's still not like a great bargain. But, you can be manipulated into thinking that it is. Another one that we see that is quite common is a confirmation bias, meaning that we have a tendency to search for or see or remember information in a way that confirms our own belief. You combine that with a recency bias, and you will believe that because you're thinking about it, you're going to see it more often because it's more frequently in your mind, and it's going to confirm your suspicion. And so now you're in this like terrible trap of believing all of your thoughts when the data all says something different. And boy, it stinks. And it even leads us then to like hindsight bias, where like when we see events as having been predictable after they have occurred, we believe that in the future we'll be able to predict them because we saw the outcome. And that might work really well for Matlock and a nice little cozy mystery, but it doesn't always work out. Evidence isn't always on display, and it may not be on display the next time you come up with it, just because afterwards, when you look at the tape, you can see it. And I think that provides a lot of forgiveness for people. But you don't always have to forgive yourself for having bias because you're working on it, right? And how do you work on it? Well, it's good to have some mitigation strategies. Ashtanga Yoga provides some really strong ones because it encourages critical thinking, meaning that we're analyzing our information systematically, piece by piece. We're looking at our breath, we're looking at our body, we're looking at the quality of the movements with a metric system of breathing, inhaling and exhaling with the japa. The method of Ashtanga really presents some stuff to us that is useful because sometimes we're having like an out of pocket reaction to something quite simple. And when we realize that kind of cut and dry, point blank, we can start to think more critically about it. That means that the information can just be information and we're studying ourselves. This is really, really great because when we start to study ourselves, we can begin to have an idea of what our norm is. And if we go out into the world knowing that our norm is a norm, it can allow us to view other viewpoints in a manner that is welcoming and curious, as opposed to pushing back or negative simply because it's oppositional to what you know. Because if you're aware of something and you're comfortable being critical of yourself, new information from other viewpoints isn't scary at all. And, over time, what's really awesome is it builds more awareness. That awareness that we build over time, it can really become quite game changing because ultimately it all comes back to awareness. As we become able more and more to witness ourselves in a non-judgmental manner, we can stay calm, cool, and collected as we see things. And it kind of sucks to know that you can be wrong and not know it. And in fact, the data reflects back to you just how silly some of our choices are. But when we're honoring the reality that it happens to the best of us, and all we can do is try to be more aware, it allows us to be mindful of bias so that we can think critically, absorb these diverse perspectives, and look out for the negative effects like judgment errors and groupthink. And, this allows us to hold space for weighing whether social influences are good or bad, and also whether the mental shortcuts that we're using are efficacious or good for us, if they're doing what we want them to, or if they're just reinforcing the hindsights, the confirmations, the different anchorings, or the availability biases that we see. All of these things are going to show up. And so long as we don't mind staying aware, staying critical, and staying in our yogic lane, these cognitive biases can actually become a platform for transcendence so that our yoga can work better and better.